Welcome to the Infinite Content Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to cover 10 different comics that I feel like are a good jumping off point for somebody who wants to read comics for the first time. Because when I first started getting into comics in around like 2012 when the Avengers came out, because it made me interested in reading comics. I'd never really actually read comics. I always enjoyed comic book movies, but I never actually read what they're based off of. So I've always felt like comics there's not really a good basis of like what should you read if you want to start reading comic books for the first time. So I thought this would be a good comprehensive list. I'm just going to jump right into it. The first comic that I want to cover is The Ultimates. Basically, The Ultimates takes place in an alternative universe. The Ultimate Universe. This started in around the early 2000s when Marvel was sort of trying to revamp things. So they decided to have kind of these modern retellings of their popular characters. And in some ways, the universe really worked out very well. It eventually sort of collapses into the main Marvel universe. It doesn't exist anymore in the current canon. But just ignore all of that and honestly just read it. The Ultimates 1 and 2 is what I'm kind of just putting them together. They're two different miniseries that ran for 13 issues each, and they're some of the best comics I've ever read. They have these great takes on the Avengers characters, basically. They don't necessarily... or actually, they really are, the Avengers movies really took a lot from the Ultimates comics, honestly. It sort of mashes that and the classic Avengers sort of setup from the typical Marvel comics. But they do a lot of just interesting things in these comics that sort of deal with real issues. They sort of deal with Hulk being like a mass murderer, and they deal with Thor sort of people not believing that he's actually a god and stuff like that, which is kind of what the Thor movies do. So I've always felt like these are great for a first-time reader because you can easily jump into these with little context, outside of even the movies, really. And that's it. There is an Ultimates 3, and there was other Ultimates titled comics, but honestly, they're bad. Different writers, and they're just not good. They're not worth reading. They're not worth spending your time on. I would honestly just recommend reading the Ultimates and the Ultimates 2. That's 26 issues total, and they're really, really worth reading. In terms of access to them, they're currently on sale on Comixology, which is a digital comic marketplace owned by Amazon. I primarily read my comics digitally because of the convenience. I would say if you don't own a tablet of some kind, it's not really a great way to read comics. I have an iPad, so it tends to be a pretty easy way to read comics. So I use Comixology, but I also use Marvel Unlimited, which is Marvel's subscription service that gives you access to an obscene amount of comics, like from Marvel's catalog, like pretty much everything you'll want to read. And it has a 6-month delay on newer comics. So basically I'm 6 months behind pretty much all the time for Marvel because I kind of don't care. Like, it doesn't bother me to be 6 months behind to save the money. But basically for Marvel Unlimited right now, it's on sale, I think, for $4 or $5 a month for the first month, by using the coupon like Endgame, obviously as a promotion for Avengers Endgame. But you can also pay $70 a year for the annual price. But if you want to try that out for a month, I think that's a really good way. You can read the Ultimates on there, and you can read every comic that's Marvel on here is on Marvel Unlimited for you to read immediately. The Marvel Unlimited app isn't the greatest app. It tends to have some issues, but for the sheer amount of content, it is 100% worth buying if you want to get into Marvel Comics specifically. But yeah, the Ultimates is a great choice to jump into, especially if you love the Avengers movies. It's a great way to jump into the storylines and these modern retellings of it. So jumping into a DC comic, the 2016 Superman run is a wonderful, just optimistic and bright and just really great comic book that is a really great portrayal of Superman. I don't even have that much of a basis for Superman. This is one of the few Superman runs I've actually read all the way through. I've read every single one, and it looks like a good chunk of them are on Comixology Unlimited, which is another subscription service that costs $6 a month. So basically, you pay $6 a month, and they have an okay catalog of comics, but you also get discounts on any comics you buy off Comixology. So that's pretty convenient, I would say. But this Superman run is definitely a really good way to jump in. It was part of the DC Universe Rebirth, which came after, which is kind of the era of comics they're still sort of in. I think they kind of took the branding off the comics. But this ran for, let me see how many issues it was. I think it was around 50 issues. Okay, it was 45 issues. So there's 45 issues for you to read of this, and I think it's just a really good comic, basically telling a story of Superman and Superboy together, and Superboy sort of learning about his powers and stuff like that. It's just a really good way if you're interested in the Superman character, or if you're not interested in the Superman character, because there's a lot of people who I feel like judge that character as being sort of silly and kind of stupid. But in all actuality, he's a really cool character, and there's a lot of great things about it. And I would highly recommend it. It has beautiful art. It has some really great storylines throughout it. And it's just a really fun comic, I would say. So the next one is another Marvel comic, and it is the 6-issue event series that came out in 1991 called the Infinity Gauntlet, which this is a big basis for what Avengers Infinity War, and I'm assuming Endgame to some extent, is based off of. It's still very, very, very different from what Infinity War at least was. Obviously, Endgame isn't out yet, but it does deal with, Thanos having the Infinity Gauntlet and the Infinity Stones and killing a lot of people. So it sort of deals with that, and it's a great way if you just want this big, massive, huge story with a bunch of characters and sprawling in 6 issues. It's currently on sale for $4 on Comixology, or it's free with Comixology Unlimited, or it's on Marvel Unlimited. But it is a wonderful 6-issue comic, and just a really good way to see comics as sort of like this really great art form in terms of storytelling and actual art. The art is gorgeous, and if you love the Thanos character as much as I do, you should definitely read this comic. So another DC comic I want to cover is an interesting 3-issue miniseries called Superman Red Sun. So basically this comic is an alternative sort of storytelling of what if Superman had landed in the Soviet Union instead of Kansas. So it tells a different origin story of Superman, and it's just super interesting. I love history. I'm a history major, so reading this was super cool. I'm very interested about the Soviet Union and its history. So like seeing a comic book tell a story, about Superman being there, it's super interesting. It's a great way if you don't really want to worry about any previous context, because it's its own thing. It's just 3 issues. You don't really need much context for anything. And again, that's on Comixology as well. It's not on Comixology Unlimited, but it's on the general sort of marketplace. In a collected edition, or it's in just 3 separate issues. But again, another high recommendation. So another comic that is published by Image Comics, and this is sort of a very obvious choice, but The Walking Dead. I actually have not read a ton of The Walking Dead. I've read some of it, but I don't have comics of the TV show. I have not really watched it, but the comic itself is very good. The art is fantastic. It's a black and white comic. And it's just, if you're into post-apocalyptic stories, you're going to like it. It's pretty inevitable. It's not so much about the zombies. It's about sort of the conflict between all the characters. A bunch of The Walking Dead is on Comixology Unlimited. It's a subscription service. And you can also buy them in compendiums and omnibuses, which are just huge, like 1,000-page volumes. They're all on sale, it looks like right now, for $20 for volumes 1 and 2, $20 each, I should say, but that's also 1,000 pages. and then $23.99 for volume 3, and that's a good chunk of the series. It's still going on. It's on, issue 192, it looks like, is the most recent pre-order you can get, which is pretty insane that it's been going for this long. But again, another high recommendation from a publisher that isn't Marvel and DC. I don't have much context for comics outside of Marvel and DC. I haven't really explored that, but Image is sort of a indie comic book publisher. So they kind of have more ambitious sort of comics, more different from your superhero affair, I would say, and sort of different types of things. So another comic I want to cover is the Avengers run from 2012 to 2015, and written by Jonathan Hickman. And you also have to read New Avengers that also ran from 2013 to 2015. You kind of read them together because their stories are intrinsically tied. So if you are going to try to read these, you kind of have to read both. But this is sort of an ambitious Avengers storyline. It's somewhat hard to read, I feel like, for a new reader, because I was definitely challenged by it. But it deals with a lot of sort of complex themes in the Marvel Universe and complex ideas. But it's also just a really fascinating comic with really, really good art. It's interesting that this comic came out when the Avengers movie came out, the original one, because that movie's sort of a great popcorn sort of movie. It's a really fun movie, but Jonathan Hickman was really trying to tell a very complex story with Avengers and New Avengers. But I don't think that should deter you from reading it. I would probably recommend reading something like The Ultimates first, but I think if you want to read something more ambitious and sort of a bit more of a challenge, the Avengers and New Avengers run from 2012 to 2015 is definitely a good choice. Which, again, a bunch of these appear to be on Comixology Unlimited, which is great, if not almost the entire run. Almost the entire run appears to be on Comixology Unlimited, so that's cool if you wanted to get that as a subscription service. One of the first comics that I ever read every single issue of was Ultimate Spider-Man. If you love Spider-Man, it is definitely the best way to read Spider-Man as an introduction. Because if you try to jump into the current runs of Amazing Spider-Man, you're dealing with an older Peter Parker, an adult Peter Parker, and you're missing a lot of context of previous issues and things like that. It's a bit more of a challenge. Even though I've sort of done it now, it's definitely more of a challenge to just be like, hey, I'm going to just jump into this. But it's just a great way if you want a really good story of teenage Peter Parker, which is basically what all the movies have been based off of, which is just really funny because the Amazing Spider-Man comics, which is the original Spider-Man comic, really almost didn't deal with him being in high school almost at all. But that's entirely what Ultimate Spider-Man is, and entirely what most of the movies have been about. All the movies have only ever gotten up to like him being in college, pretty much, for the most part. So it's really interesting that that's what they've always based it on. I think a lot of that has to do with the influence of Ultimate Spider-Man and how popular of a comic it is. Ultimate Spider-Man ran for a ton of issues, like over 200. Not in the original run. They retitled it a couple times, and then they eventually, Miles Morales becomes a character. There's definitely, once you get towards like past the 100 issue point, artists sort of changed. It's the same writer, but the stories sort of get weaker. But I think it's worth sort of seeing those through and getting through them all so you can get to the Miles Morales run of the comics. And eventually when Miles Morales is put into the normal Marvel universe, it's worth reading those comics as well because he's such a great character. But Ultimate Spider-Man gets probably my highest recommendation of any comic on this list. It is the number one comic I would choose for someone to be like, hey, you want to get into comics, read this. Because it's just such an easy comic to read and jump into without really any good any context. And it's also such a good comic for a good chunk of the run, I would say. And that says a lot. The next comic is for anyone who's interested in Star Wars, because the Star Wars 2015 comic, which is still running, it's still going. I'm obviously on the Marvel Unlimited run of the comics, so I'm a bit behind. Star Wars comics are obviously published by Marvel. They used to be published by Dark Horse, another somewhat popular publisher of comics, I would say. But the 2015 Star Wars comic basically takes place in between episode 4 and 5. I think it's sort of still under that timeline, I'm pretty sure. But basically, if you want stories about the main three characters, Luke, Leia, Han, and what happened in between the movies, this is the comic for you. It's telling those stories. They're well written. Literally every issue is just a fun, great Star Wars adventure. And it's one of the best things, I think, in the new Star Wars canon, just in general, with comics, books, shows, whatever. The canon under Disney, I think it's one of the best things I've read, because every issue is enjoyable. There's never been an issue that I feel like I've hated of this comic. If you're truly an original trilogy fanboy, you love those movies, there's no way in hell you won't love this comic. It's just the perfect comic for an original trilogy movie fan. And those are, in a lot of ways, those are still the best Star Wars movies to me. I love the new Disney movies as well, and I'm pretty iffy on the prequels, but I still accept them for what they are, and I still enjoy them to some extent, but I think they have a lot of issues, but that doesn't really matter. But the original trilogy is still sort of what I hold as, Star Wars at its pinnacle, and these comics embody that and embody how that feels. So another comic is Batman, and this is the 2011 to 2016 run, also known as the New 52 run. It was sort of a weird reboot, kind of not a reboot of the DC universe. It's always confusing when they try to reboot comic universes, because they always kind of do, and they reset it to number one, and it's always kind of confusing. DC definitely does a better job than Marvel when it comes to releasing new number one comics and trying to introduce new readers. DC does a better job of trying to get new readers in. I feel like they make it easier with their new number ones when they start them. But Batman New 52 it's just a really easy way to get into Batman. I feel like there's just some really, really good storylines, both involving new villains and the Joker and old villains, and it does just a really good job. And Scott Snyder's the writer, and it's just good writing. If you like the Batman character, if you've liked the Dark Knight movies, or any of the Batman movies, there's no way you're not going to find some enjoyment. I do feel like towards the end of it starts to lose some quality, but a good chunk of it is really, really good and really, really worth reading. Some of the first chunk of issues appear to be on Comixology Unlimited. It's looking like the first 23, 24 issues are on Comixology Unlimited, which is, almost half the run. So that's a good chunk you can read if you get Comixology Unlimited. Otherwise, it looks like the collected editions of them are on sale. They're like a good $5-6 off the price for most of them. Comixology always has sales going on, like literally all the time. So you're always going to find something on sale that you'll probably want. So it's definitely a good way. But yeah, the Batman 2011 to 2016 run, which is also known as the New 52, is a really good way to jump in. But the last comic that I put on this list is the Immortal Hulk, which is a currently running comic that only started last year. And I really like this comic from what I've read. Obviously, I'm only caught up with what is available on Marvel Unlimited, so I'm behind. I do feel as though this comic is the first time I've read any of the Hulk comics, and it actually felt like it told a really compelling story. I've never felt like he holds his own very well as a solo comic, but this sort of tells a very horrific, sort of tragic story of the Hulk, as he gets killed at one point in the Marvel Universe. It's not really a spoiler. Characters die all the time and then just come back. So this is kind of him coming back. And they really deal with him being sort of this horror figure, tragic figure. And they do a really good job of it. And that's the way I feel like Hulk's story should be told. So I just felt like I should put in like a very, very recent comic in this list. And I think this is definitely one of the best of recent comics right now. It's just, if you like the Hulk character and you want to see more of what that character is all about, I think it's a really good way to jump into it. So that's pretty much it for my list of 10 comics you can jump into. I know it was technically more than 10, but I sort of meshed 2 of them together. But I think this is a solid list if you are interested in reading comics for the first time. Again, I think Marvel Unlimited and Comixology Unlimited are some of the best ways you can jump into comics. If you have an iPad especially, it's going to be a really easy way for you to get access to comics. But otherwise, go find these comics at your local comic book store. There's nothing wrong with that if you want physical. I know a lot of comic book stores are hurting these days, which is ironic when you think about it, because comic book movies are more popular than ever, but it seems like people aren't reading comics as much as maybe they should be, or a lot of people have gone digital, as I have. I still like to occasionally buy comics from a comic book store. I used to, but switching to digital was just easier for me once I got an iPad, especially with Marvel Unlimited. It was just a lot cheaper for me to read comics that way. Same with Comixology, like sales and stuff like that has just made it a more affordable venture for me, because comics are very expensive to get into. But again, I would say Marvel Unlimited and Comixology Unlimited and Comixology sales in general are going to be some of the best ways you can jump into this. But again, nothing wrong with going to your local comic book store and supporting them, because they deserve your support. It's hard to run a comic book store and make a lot of money and really be very profitable these days. So there's no harm in going to support them if you have the money to spare, especially. So that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed this. If you're looking to get into comics, I think it's an art form, and it's literature, and people should be reading it. It's sad to see these movies be so popular, and I love that they're this popular. But more people should read the comics, because they're missing out on a good portion. There's nothing wrong with not reading the comics if you're obviously just not interested. But if you are, you should definitely make the jump and look into it. So that's it for the Infinite Content podcast this time. I hope you enjoyed.